Ok. Então, eu vou apresentar a professora Nancy em português, nós combinamos assim, e depois ela vai dar a palestra dela em inglês, mas com uma ampla ilustração de slides, acho que vai ser fácil para acompanhar, né? Então, é com muita satisfação que a área de etologia do Instituto de Psicologia, do Departamento de Psicologia Experimental, apresenta a professora Nancy Segal, da California State University, que é diretora do Centro de Estudos de Gêmeos, com a qual nós estamos estabelecendo uma parceria. Ela tem um trabalho muito interessante sobre comportamento e características psicológicas de gêmeos e como esses gêmeos podem nos ajudar a delinear testes de hipóteses evolucionistas. Então, passo a palavra a Nancy. You're welcome.
Where is it? Oh, it's not responding. Oh, okay. Okay. Boa tarde. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's wonderful to see you all here. This is my first time in Brazil, and I've had a wonderful time so far. I started out in Sao Paulo, and then I went to Foz do Iguaçu, and then to Rio, and to Natal, and now that I'm back in Sampa, I feel like I'm at home again. I want to thank Emma for the wonderful invitation to come here to be part of the establishment of the Brazilian Twin Registry. It's a very exciting project. It's wonderful to be at the beginning of this and to see how far I know it's going to go. So today I want to talk about twin studies for evolutionary hypothesis testing. And I first want to talk about the different types of twins, and then to tell you about the different ways that we use twins to study human physical and behavioral characteristics. And then I'll talk about how we use twins to test various evolutionary-based hypotheses. So I think we all know that there are two types of twins. There are the monozygotic or identical twins that result when the fertilized egg divides sometime between the 1st or 14th post-conceptional day, resulting in two genetically identical individuals. But we also have fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins, that come in two varieties, the same sex or the opposite sex. And these twins share half the genes in common, on average, by descent. And I purposely picked the two pairs you see here because the girls look very, very different. But the opposite sex twins, even though they have different gender, look very much alike. So fraternal twins are on this interesting spectrum of genetic relatedness. Okay. So there are many variations within the two types of twins, and I don't have time today to go through all of them, but I'll mention a few that I think are the most relevant to questions we might pose in evolutionary psychology. And one of them is when twins actually have different fathers. We don't know how often this occurs because not all the cases are identified or documented. But what happens is that if a woman has sexual relationships with two different fathers, then there's a window of opportunity for fertilization. And so the twins could possibly have different fathers in this case, which would make them genetic half-siblings. And so you have to ask yourself the question, would a father feel more attached to one child with whom he perceives more physical relatedness or more behavioral similarities? Is there paternity uncertainty regarding the other child? So it's easy to see how this could become part of a more systematic study. And similarly, in this case, if you have a couple of mixed ethnic backgrounds, and I know you have many couples of mixed background here in Brazil, you can have twins who are full ordinary siblings, but they look very, very different. And if this father had only had one child and it had been the child that he's holding, maybe he would have some doubt. It's possible. So these are other ways that one could test concepts relating to paternity uncertainty. And finally, this couple here, the father is of mixed background, and they had fraternal twin girls who look extremely different. And in fact, they had a second pair of fraternal girls who also look extremely different. So the classic twin design, which was actually developed by Sir Francis Galton in the late 1800s, although that was prior to the time that we had defined monozygotic and dizygotic, Galton just knew that there were look-alike twins and non-look-alike twins, and he correctly surmised that the look-alikes shared their genes in common, all of them, whereas the fraternal twins did not. But you simply compare the similarity of identical twins to fraternal twins with regard to height or weight or intelligence or anything you want to measure. And if the identical twins are more alike, which they usually are, this is consistent with genetic influence on that particular behavior. So you can see here that with height, the identical girls are much more alike than the fraternals, but of course I would do this with many, many pairs. Now the next slide is very funny. Okay, so why do I show this? Those identical girls are 6 feet 6 inches tall, and they hold the record in the Guinness Book for being the world's tallest identical twins. And we're just standing on the same floor, flat shoes, but I'm much smaller than they are. Some of the other twin designs, if you look at the girls on the left, these are identical twins who differ naturally. And we call this natural co-twin control, because you have the same genes, but something in the environment has happened to make the twins different. And this is extremely fascinating and extremely important, because we can use this information to understand what triggers a disease or what keeps a disease from being expressed, and use this information to help the non-twin population. So there are 3 ways that these girls differ. 2 you can see and 1 you can't see. You can see that one is heavier than the other, and you can see that one has a space between her teeth. What you can't see is that the girl on the right also has breast cancer. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. Why does one twin have it? Why does one not? So this is something that we can start to investigate. And by the way, you'll notice they're holding little cups, right? So if you want to know what's in the cup, it's sake. It's not cachaça. This was at a wedding, a Japanese wedding. Then we have twins raised apart, actually triplets in some cases. Those are monozygotic triplets. And they were separated at birth, and they did not meet each other until they were 19 years old. And the way they met was purely through mistaken identity, where one went to a college and then left the college. The other one came to the same college. People thought he was the first one returning and put them together. Their picture was in the New York Times, and then someone saw it and showed it to a friend who was the third triplet. So they were very, very fascinating. And in fact, one of those triplets is left-handed, and he has an opposite facial asymmetry to the 2 brothers. And this is very common in twins, especially those who split somewhat late, at about day 8 or 9. This is a very interesting twin study that happens simply when twins marry and have children, just like anybody else, but it leads to a whole fascinating series of comparisons. So there we have family 1 and twin 1, and family 2 with twin 2. So the mothers here are identical twins, and they married unrelated partners. And they both had children. And because the mothers are genetically the same, they are really the genetic mothers of their nieces and nephews. Same would happen if the fathers were the twins. And the children are legal cousins, first cousins, but they're also genetic half-siblings because they share a parent who's genetically the same. So we can ask various kinds of questions. Many behavior geneticists have said, how similar is twin one to her own children with whom she shares genes and environment, compared to her nieces and nephews with whom she shares just genes. But this design lends itself to some interesting evolutionary studies too, which I'll talk about a little bit later. This is a kinship that I discovered by accident, and I love it. It's what I call virtual twins. And these are people who are genetically unrelated, but they come into the family at the same time. So they're raised in a twin-like situation, but they have no genes in common. And you can ask yourself, how similar are they, having shared an environment but no genes? And they also lend themselves well to evolutionary hypothesis testing. The little girls you see here are a biological child in the family plus an adoptee, and the two little boys are both adopted. I have very strict criteria for who I allow into my study, because I want to keep it very, very clean. So virtual twins must be in the same home by age 1 year. Their age difference can be no more than 9 months, because that is the typical difference, at least in the US, of children in the same classroom. But most of these children are no more than 3 months, and I even have some born on the same day. The children must be in the same grade in school to preserve the twin-like nature of the relationship. And if they've experienced any negative or adverse birth effects, then I don't take them either. And finally, I've recently discovered a group of unrelated lookalikes. These people here share no genes in common. They just happen to be people who look alike. And this was a project I learned about going on in Canada, in Montreal, by a photographer who has the hobby. He just enjoys taking pictures of people who look alike, but he had no idea that this would be so scientifically interesting until I got a hold of him and begged him to let me use some of his pairs. And so I'll tell you more about that later as well. My late friend and colleague, Linda Mealy, in 2001 wrote the following. She said that for evolutionary psychologists, kinship via the effect of inclusive fitness constitutes a core construct of relevance to all social interaction. And that is the framework that I use, basically, when I do my studies. I'm very interested in social relatedness, cooperation, competition, altruism, tacit coordination. So this is sort of the overarching framework for much of the work that I do. And so with regard to evolutionary hypothesis testing, based on Hamilton's work in '64, we know that altruistic acts benefit a recipient at some cost to the actor, and that's something we can assess as well. We predict that altruism should be directed toward close relatives more often than distant ones, or toward non-kin, as an indirect way of transmitting common genes. And inclusive fitness, reproductive success is enhanced by effects on relatives other than offspring. So with those ideas in mind, this is the very first twin study I ever conducted, and I call it the Twins as Couples Design because there is no name for it. That's something I made up, but it captures the idea perfectly. Because here, I'm not interested in how similar twin A is to twin B. I'm interested in the social interactional processes and outcomes that emerge when identical twins work together and when fraternal twins work together. So what I'm testing here is, do identical twins cooperate more than fraternal twins when they're working on a common task? So I used twins from about the age of 7 through 9 or 10, and the activity was to just solve a puzzle together. So it was a semi-naturalistic study. I went to homes and put a puzzle in between the children and told them to solve it together. And I made movies of them. So these are the stills from some of the films, and you can see that the identical twins are facing each other. The puzzle is between them. They seem very happy to work on this together. But something different is happening with the fraternal twins. What actually happened here was that the girl on your left took all the pieces like this, put them in front of her, and wouldn't let her sister do anything. So she's eventually looking up at me. And those were very common trends that I saw across the different series. I think the identicals cooperate more because they are more behaviorally similar, and they perceive similarities between themselves. I did another study as a part of this project where I had the children, individual twins, just circle little objects. And I said, the more objects you can circle in 2 minutes, the more points you will win for a prize. But after that, the twins were told, now you can circle these objects again, but now you're winning points for your twin. So my question is, are you going to do the same for your twin? Are you going to do less for your twin, maybe more than your twin? And how would that differ for identicals and fraternals? It turned out that the identical twins, well, first of all, every twin worked harder for themselves than for their twin. But the identical twins worked much more for the twin than the fraternal twins did. So it seemed to me that in that situation, identical twins cooperated more by competing less. In this study, I showed the films to independent judges, and we were able to disguise the twin type to get a more authentic evaluation. And we found that more identical twins completed the puzzle than did the fraternals. And that makes sense because the identical twins worked on it as if it were one puzzle. The fraternal twins were kind of messy. They each took pieces to other sides of the table. It took them longer to get together. We found that the puzzle placement was more equidistant between the identical twins, and that there was a more balanced involvement between them. And we found that these findings and others were unrelated to the parents' beliefs about whether they had identical or fraternal twins, whether the twins thought they looked alike or not, and whether the family belonged to a twin group. So now I'm going to turn to another project I've been involved with, the Minnesota study of twins raised apart. And that's the cover from the book that I wrote that came out in 2012. The study began in 1979 and went on for 20 years, although I was only involved for 9 of those years between 1982 and 1991. This was a comprehensive study of behavioral and physical similarities and differences between identical and fraternal twins who've been reared apart from birth. In total, there were 137 twins, approximately 80 identical pairs, and the rest were fraternals. So these are the twins that started the whole project. And this afternoon, this is the first of 2 topless, hairy male twins I'm going to show you. There's one more pair coming up in a moment. So in February of 1979, these twins met for the first time when they were 40. And it created a lot of media attention in the United States. The twins were very, very similar in lots and lots of different ways, from smoking the same cigarettes to driving the same cars, having the same dogs, the same names, and lots of things. And Professor Bouchard, who directed the study, thought it would be interesting to invite them to the university and to study them and maybe find a few other pairs. But this pair created so much attention, as did the others, that before he knew it, there were 15 pairs, and then there were more, and it was impossible to stop. And I went there as a postdoctoral fellow, and it was probably the most wonderful time of my entire career. Meeting these twins was just, it was like magic. It was seeing, you read about data in a journal, and then you see it come alive. And that was absolutely extraordinary. So where did we find these twins? We found them in lots of different ways, but mostly through self-referrals, people who would hear about the project and then contact us. But we also learned about them through the media. We learned about them through adoption services and from some previous twin participants. So here's the second topless, hairy male pair. So Mark and Jerry were volunteer firemen who grew up about 30 or 40 miles apart in New Jersey. And they look a lot alike, as you can see. One was much heavier, but nevertheless, they got to meet because one was mistaken for the other. And their similarities go from their mustache to their glasses and the beer can. They had a taste for Budweiser beer, which they held with a pinky finger underneath. Now, a lot of people think things like that are simply quirks, coincidence. You know, we all have funny little habits that we do, let's admit it. But when you see this repeated in two people, and you see other unusual things repeated in identical twins, it suggests maybe something else is going on. So it challenges us to come up with an explanation. So why would people hold beer cans like this? Maybe the anatomy of their hand makes it more comfortable. Or maybe they're nervous about spilling the beer. But whatever it is, there's something going on. And it means that if we had identical twins and we did something a little odd, they would probably be doing it too. This is one of the most fascinating pairs of twins we ever studied, Jack and Oscar. Jack on your left, well, both the twins were born in Trinidad. They were born in 1933 to a Jewish father who had escaped persecution in Romania and to a Catholic mother from Germany who left Germany for a better life. And so they met in Trinidad, and they had these identical boys, Jack on your left and Oscar on your right. And the parents' marriage fell apart after 6 months. And so Jack stayed with his father, was raised Jewish in Trinidad, and the mother took Oscar back with her to Germany. And he was only 12 when the war ended, but he was in the Hitler Youth like all the kids were, and he enjoyed it, he told me, because it was a chance not to go to church and a chance to play sports. So these twins grew up in very, very different circumstances, and they had very different understandings and ideas about politics and about history. So when they met for the first time at 20, they met in Germany, and it was a very difficult reunion. They thought they would never see each other again. And then when they were 40, by this time Jack had moved to California, and they'd heard about the Minnesota study, at least Jack did, and he thought, let's give it another try. So he contacted Oscar, and they came to Minnesota, and they had many, many similarities in personality, ability, the way they dressed, except for their political and historical opinions. And they used to argue with each other all the time. And I'm convinced that if they hadn't been twins, they never would have been friends. Because why would you put up with that? But they were fascinated by their similarities. And they told me that they know that if their positions had been reversed, they would have grown up as the person whose views they most despised. I mean, that's really something to think about. It shows you the importance of context. It shows the importance of genes, but also the importance of context, because they both would cope with their situation the same way. Jack was afraid in Trinidad, British-controlled Trinidad. He was afraid that somebody would discover his German roots. And Oscar was afraid that somebody in Germany would discover his Jewish ones. So he became very pro-German. So they both handled their situation the same way, but yet their ideas, their politics, their history, their perspectives came from their environment. So the Minnesota study of twins reared apart had many, many papers that came out. And there were two that really got a lot of attention and were quite pivotal, I would say, in drawing attention to the project and leading us in new directions. And the first one in 1988 was a study on personality similarity. And it was the first study to have 4-group design, identical and fraternal twins reared apart and reared together. And the extraordinary finding from that study was that the identical twins raised apart were as similar as the identical twins raised together. It doesn't make sense intuitively. People who live together you think should be more alike, but that was not the case. So what that tells us is that when you're living with your relatives, the environment does not make you alike. It's your common genes that make you alike. It doesn't mean environments don't matter. The similarity was only 50% heritability. But the part of the environment that makes a difference are the non-shared experiences, the things that we experienced uniquely apart from our family, such as a trip to Europe or a college professor or a book that we read, something unique that we experienced that the other family members did not. And the other pivotal paper was in Science in 1990 on IQ. And we found there a 70% heritability for general intelligence, very consistent with 3 previous studies done in Denmark, England, and also the US. And those studies, all 4 were done with different populations, different tests, different countries, different investigators. But it's a very robust finding, this one is. Same findings and yet totally different populations. So when I came to the University of Minnesota, the study had been ongoing for about 3 years. And I noticed that there was no component in the study that addressed the social relatedness of the twins. What was it like to meet a twin after all these years? And did identical twins form a closer relationship than fraternals, as I would expect given my evolutionary background? And how did the twins feel about adoptive siblings they were raised with? In other words, do you feel closer to someone you just meet, or do you feel closer to someone you've grown up with all your life? So we composed a very lengthy social relationship questionnaire. And some of the items were, when I met my twin for the first time, I felt we would become closer than best friends, as close as best friends, on to less close than most people I meet for the first time. And this was repeated for feelings of familiarity, both in the current time frame and for adoptive siblings. So here are the results that I published in 2003. 80% of the identical twins felt closer and more familiar to each other than best friends, compared with about 60 to 70% of fraternals, which is what I would expect because that mirrors relationships of twins raised together and is consistent with genetic and kinship genetic predictions. But I think the one that really surprised me, partly, but really fits in perfectly within this paradigm, is that only 20 to 30% of the twins felt closer or more familiar than best friends toward the adoptive siblings they were raised with. That's very informative information, I believe. It shows that close relationships do not really need a lot of shared time, but rather I believe it's the perceptions of similarity that are the social glue that draw people together and maintain that relationship. There are other ways that we found twins raised apart. I should actually say that after the study ended in 1999, there were still twins reared apart being found, and somehow they all come to me. And these little girls were first reunited at the age of 6 years. The little girl on your left was raised in Sacramento, California, and the one on the right in Fresvik, Norway, a tiny town that most of my colleagues had never heard of. And it turned out that with the one-child policy in China, families in urban areas were restricted to 1 child, families in rural areas to 2, and families prefer boys. So thousands and thousands of baby girls were simply abandoned. Among them were twins. And when the couples who adopted these babies went to China to get them, they immediately noticed the similarities between them, and they exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, and they got in touch later on. And then when they contacted me, I arranged for the DNA testing, and then I contacted the BBC, and they were filmed, and all kinds of great things have happened to these girls. But I want to show you the very first reunion between them. I think most people have never seen twins meet for the first time. I've seen it on several occasions, and it's truly a marvelous and extraordinary event.
Want me to hold you so you can get higher? Okay.
Oh. There they are.
Hey, wait, Leah. Careful, Leah. Open the door?
I don't know. I don't know.
Hello.
So as a result of that pair and a few others, I decided to do a study of young Chinese twins adopted apart. And so far I've found 16, 9 identical monozygotics reared apart and 7 dizygotic. So it's proceeding slowly, and I probably will not get big numbers. I think there are probably twins out there who will never know they're twins and will never find each other. But what is unique about this particular study is that it's prospective and ongoing, whereas the other studies all found the twins as adults and had to recollect their childhood histories. So I'm tracking the twins as they develop, and I've gotten some of them as young as 3 years of age. In the left panel, you see twins meet for the first time on the opposite sides of the barrier. And then another pair of twins I studied later on, and the twins you just saw in the picture. One thing I should point out, I don't know if any of you were taking photographs, but I should have probably mentioned in the beginning that I don't have permission to show these in the media, just to people like you. So enough said. Just don't get me in trouble, please. So I also reunited a pair of twins from England. Actually, one from England, the one on your left, and the one on the right from Oregon in the United States. And these are the world's longest separated pair of twins in the world. They met for the first time at the age of 78, and they are in the Guinness Book of Records. It was very exciting to reunite them too. These are fraternal twins, and here is their reunion as filmed by the BBC.
See how lovely. Oh, how lovely to see you in the flesh. Oh, that is lovely. Here we are. We are. Sisters. Blue eyes. Mother's blue eyes. Hello, Mother. See you. Did you have a nice trip over?
Yeah, wonderful.
Oh, good. Oh, lovely.
I should just point out that that was a wonderful reunion. Those twins did not go on to form the same close relationship as the identical twins. And I think it's because they did not perceive the same degree of behavioral resemblance as the identical twins do. But nevertheless, to meet a twin for the first time at any time, whether it's identical or fraternal, is very exciting. So I want to turn now to twin studies of tacit coordination. And first, let's define what that means. So tacit coordination refers to circumstances in which two parties have identical interests and face the problem not of reconciling interests, but only of coordinating their actions for their mutual benefit when communication is impossible. These are the kind of slides, by the way, that anybody can take pictures of. I don't care. So what would an example be? If you're in a department store, let's say, a big department store, and you're with someone and you lose them, you have to decide, where would I go to meet them? So you want to go to a place that two people would be likely to go to. So maybe you both are interested in electronics, you're both interested in the sports department. So it's not that I would go to the place that my partner likes, or she would go to the place that I would like. But what place could you mutually agree upon in the event that you could not discuss it? And this concept comes from Schelling's 1960 book, The Strategy of Conflict. So I also want to make a distinction here between coordination, cooperation, and altruism. So again, coordination is behavior on the part of both interactants that leads to mutual gain. Cooperation is behavior by an actor that involves mutual benefits for both interactants. And altruism is behavior that benefits the recipient at some cost to the benefactor. So the theoretical perspectives that I brought to bear on the tacit coordination study were behavioral genetic theory and kinship genetic theory, where I asked the question, is tacit coordination a mechanism underlying social relatedness? So the main hypothesis based on these tasks is that monozygotic twins will score higher on these tasks than dizygotic twins, and they in turn will score higher than virtual twins. And you see there the two twins completing the tasks independently. And what was that task? So we had two conditions. In the individual condition, they're given a sheet of 20 questions and told, answer the questions. So name a car, name a US town or city, write down a boy's name. So they do that. And I would expect identical twins to be more alike than fraternals, more alike than virtual twins, which brings in the behavior genetic theory. But in condition number 2, which is the coordination condition, they're told to answer so that you and your sibling or twin end up with the same answer, what we call non-negotiated consensus. So you have to think here now, if we could talk to each other, what would we agree on? The evaluation criteria were organized into a broad match and an exact match. So if, for example, for the boy's name, one twin put Ron and one put Ronald, or one put red and one put crimson for a favorite color, those would be considered general or broad matches. But an exact match would have to be Ron and Ron, or red and red. And the data I'm going to show you refer to the exact matches only, because that's harder to achieve and I think is a more strict separation between the 3 different groups. So here are the groups. We had 53 MZ pairs, 85 DZ pairs, and 42 virtual pairs. And the mean ages were about 9 3/4 for MZ and DZ, a little older for the virtual twins. There. So the results are summarized in this particular slide. Let me walk you through it. We organized the questionnaire, the 20 questions, into 2 parts because they would complete the first 10 questions, then do something else, and then do the second 10 questions. So part 1, part 2. You can see that for all 3 groups, the MZ, DZ, and virtual twin, in both parts, that they do better in the individual, and better in the coordination condition, where they're told to come up with the same answer than they do in the individual. But the MZ twins outscore the DZ twins, who outscore the virtual twins right across the board, just as we expected. So it seems that the MZ twins are better able to coordinate based on their, I think, the way they react to the world, the way they process information. They're better able to figure out what would be the place to match if they could not discuss with one another. And this just simply reports the statistics that we used for that analysis. But I want to get to the summary and implications, which I think are more important. So the results support behavioral, genetic, and evolutionary psychological predictions, namely that greater coordination is expected between close genetic relatives than between relatively distant genetic relatives. A genetic basis for attention to selected features predisposing individuals to favor one choice or strategy over another is suggested. So now we have to think, and I'm still kind of working on this, what is it that enables identical twins to come up with the same thing? Is there some clue that's driving it? For example, if they both pick the same boy's name or they both pick the same ice cream flavor, what is the clue? Is there something that's driving that? Why would they both pick vanilla? So that's something I'm trying to work out. Tacit coordination and mutual awareness of non-negotiated match choices may represent a class of mechanisms by which close relatives develop and maintain close social relations. common, independently made choices may function as unambiguous indicators of similarity. So what I'm suggesting here is that if I do something and someone else does something, a close genetic relative of mine, this is a similar behavior, and it maybe triggers a sense of affiliation between that person. And that's more likely to happen between close relatives than non-relatives, or less distant or more distant ones. So these may actually help to foster and to maintain close social relationships. And finally, future studies will compare behavior on coordination and cooperation tasks and offer incentives, since these can sometimes alter the effects of a game. So now I'm going to move on to another design that I talked to you about in the beginning, identical and fraternal twin parents, social closeness to nieces and nephews. And you can see in the slide there are two identical twins there, and they're each married to different people, and the one on your left has two little girls, the one on the right has a little boy. But keep in mind that each twin is the genetic mother to the other one's children, and the children in the two families are half-siblings. We did this study over the internet, mostly. I also was at a Twins Day festival held every year in Ohio, and I got maybe 50 pairs of twins there. But most of them came from the internet. Now you'll notice there are 320 MZ twins, and these are individual twins. Some are in pairs, but most of them are individuals, and only 99 DZ twins. And that is the complete flip-flop of the population distribution of twins. And that's because this was a volunteer twin sample. Whenever you do a volunteer twin sample, the rule of 2/3 is what happens. And actually, I have a rule of 3/4 here. But my colleague, David Licken at the University of Minnesota, said that whenever you do a volunteer twin sample, you get 2/3 identicals and 2/3 females. And that's because identical twins are more invested in the relationship, more excited about being a twin, more interested in research participation. And females are more likely to participate as well. So it's fine to do research this way, but you have to just keep in mind that maybe you're not getting the most representative sample. That's why a registry is much, much better. Anyway, we composed a questionnaire asking various items about social relatedness to the niece or nephew. So sample questions would be, I like taking care of this child. This child behaves like he or she could have been my child, and I generally think of this child as my own. We found that the MZ twin aunts and uncles expressed greater closeness to nieces and nephews than DZ twin aunts and uncles. And also that twins expressed greater closeness to nieces and nephews who were born to twin sisters than to twin brothers. And I suspect that might be linked to paternity uncertainty, because you know that a child from your twin sister is related to you, but a child from your twin brother may or may not be. And this slide summarizes the findings. If you look first to graph 3, zygosity, you see that the MZ score higher on the closeness scale than the DZ. The fourth one is co-twin sex. So it's the sex of my co-twin. So if my co-twin is female, then I feel closer to my nieces and nephews. And that pattern is repeated if you look at the MZ and DZ twins. So now I'm going to turn to a rather unhappy subject, which is the loss of a twin. And I never intended to do a study like this, but when I was in Minnesota, I would get calls, emails, all kinds of contacts from people who lost a twin and wanted information about why they could not get over their grief. And no one had really studied this in detail, so I decided to do that. And I have now over 750 bereaved twins. And I also have many more monozygotic than dizygotic. And I think it's, again, because it's a volunteer twin sample. And I worry a little about the results, which I'm going to show you next. Basically, what I found and what I hypothesized was that MZ twins would have higher grief than DZ twins and twin grief would be higher than the grief for other relatives. So here we compare the MZ and DZ grief, and you can see that it's slightly higher for MZs. It is statistically significantly higher, but a low effect size. I think it's significant because I have so many subjects. But nevertheless, I think that in the real world, the difference should be larger because these DZ twins who come forward are probably not a representative sampling of DZ twins. They're the ones who feel especially grieved over their twin brother or twin sister. More interesting is this slide here, which shows paired comparisons between the loss of a twin and the loss of a non-twin relative. Now, the sample sizes vary because not every twin lost someone in all these categories. And they vary from 11 to 286. Now, most of them have at least 100 people. 11 was only for nieces and nephews. But what I wanted to call your attention to is that for first-degree relatives, first of all, you see that the loss of a twin is higher in almost every case, and significantly so. For first-degree relatives like mother, father, sister, brother, the grief is fairly high, but it drops off for second-degree relatives like aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Nieces and nephews, even though the numbers are very small, are higher, perhaps because these are children representing a source of genetic potential. The most interesting one, I think, is the spouse. That one is exactly the same as the twin. And at first, I thought this doesn't make sense because you don't share genes with your spouse. But because of your spouse, you get your genes out there in the population. Without the spouse, you do not. So that may be what's driving this. Of course, not consciously, but that may be partly what's driving that. Okay, so 2 more studies to go here. Question, do parents favor their adoptive or biological children? And we tested predictions from kin selection, which predict that parental perceptions of adoptees should be less favorable. And we also tested the compensatory model, which is that parental perceptions of adoptees are more favorable. And this is work I published with Norman Lee from Singapore in Evolution and Human Behavior just last year. Now, one thing I should point out is that this question has been asked in different ways by a number of investigators. But most other investigators have not had biological and adopted children in the same family. It's been independent families. And the very few that have looked at children who differ in age. So what's unique about this study is that I used my virtual twins, the biological adopted kids. And so they are the same age where family dynamics and all of that are exactly matched. And they've been in the family for about the same time. So there were 41 pairs. You'll notice 76 individuals. And it's not that I can't do math. It's that some of the children are in more than one pair because some of the families had in vitro fertilization triplets and an adoptee. So you get 3 pairs of virtual twins from one family. So there were 76 individuals and fairly evenly divided by gender. So these are the measures that we used. We had the Wechsler IQ test scores that were administered independently to the children by outside examiners. We had the adjective checklist where we got our positive traits, order and intellectance, which I will define in the next slide. And we had 2 negative traits from the child behavior checklist, unfavorableness and externalizing behavior. So order is defined as emphasizing neatness, organization, and planning activities. Intellectance is rationality and analysis valued more than emotion. Unfavorableness is the number of undesirable adjectives that are checked. And externalizing behavior is aggressive, hyperactive, non-compliant, and uncontrolled behavior. And these are all parental ratings, mostly by the mother. So what we found for IQ is that the biological children outscore the non-biological children. And keep in mind that these are children in the same family who came in as babies before age 1. This is a pattern you see in virtually every single study of adoptees, that biological children in the family do better. I think it's because adopted children are simply more heterogeneous. They come from very mixed backgrounds. Some of the parents suffer from impulse control or lack thereof. So it's just a more heterogeneous grouping. Now, if you look at the positive traits, you see that they don't differ between adoptees and biological children. They're just about the same. And I think the reason for this is that the compensatory model here, I think, is what explains this. That there still is somewhat of a stigma of adoption. It's getting much less so. But I think that parents of adoptees really want to be super parents and really want to feel that they're doing the best thing they can for adopted children. So in their mind's eye, these children are exactly the same when it comes to positive traits. But that's not what happens when it comes to negative traits. Here you see that for unfavorableness and externalizing behavior, the adopted children are rated significantly higher than the biological children. And that may be because, well, first of all, this is consistent with kinship genetic predictions. But I think the reason for this is that parents may not feel responsible for negative traits in the child. After all, the child is adopted, so anything negative must come from the child's biology, and I'm not responsible. I don't think parents consciously think that, but I think that could possibly underlie this difference. So we have support for kin selection theory in that adoptees were rated higher than biological children on negative traits, but support for compensation theory in that there was no difference in positive traits. And I think what this does is simply call for refinement of our understanding of kin selection theory. You know, evolved psychological mechanisms have not caught up with modern society. And today there are many more adoptees available. Families come in all sorts of sizes and shapes. We have my children, your children, our children. Children are adopted. There's egg donation. All kinds of things are going on. And adopting a child really appeals to the natural tendency to want to care for children. So I think that the fact that both of these theoretical frameworks were supported is fine and really challenges us to think more carefully about what it means to adopt. The last study I'm going to talk about is personality similarity and social closeness, what unrelated lookalikes tell us. Okay, so, you know, I love twin research, but not everybody does. And there's a frequent criticism of twin research that monozygotic co-twins' personality similarity comes from similar treatment by others due to their physical resemblance. So in other words, identical twins are similar because people treat them alike based on how they look. It doesn't make any sense to me. Behavior is not in your face, it's in your brain. I do think that people treat identical twins more alike, but I think it's because they evoke similar treatment from others around them. So the resolution is that unrelated lookalikes parallel MZA twins due to their matched appearance and separate rearing, but they lack a genetic link. So the unrelated lookalikes that I discovered in Canada were actually a wonderful way to really strictly test this criticism that's been raised so often. So the rationale is, first, if physical appearance triggers certain classes of treatment by others, then the personality similarity of unrelated lookalikes should approach that of MZ twins or at least DZ twins. Alternatively, if shared genes underlie MZ co-twins' matched behaviors, then unrelated lookalikes should show little or no resemblance in personality or self-esteem. And I predicted the second one would be supported by the data, and in fact it was. So here was Francois Brunel, who is the photographer who took all these photographs. I don't know why he calls his project I'm Not a Lookalike, because they are lookalikes. But anyway. So here again are two examples of people who look alike but are genetically unrelated. I administered 3 different inventories to the unrelated lookalikes, and this was all done in French because they came from the French-speaking part of Canada. So we had a personality inventory that was composed by a French and a Belgian investigator, the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which is available in many, many different languages, and a social relationship inventory that I composed that was very similar to one that the twins completed. There were 23 pairs, half of them were female-female. The age was 46, but ranged from 16 to 84, and the age difference about 6.5, but ranged from 0 to 20. And the meeting interval is simply how much time it was between the time they met and the time that I studied them, and that ranged from 0 to 40. So here you can see a lot of data here, but I'll just direct your attention to what's important. I had the big 5 personality traits of stability, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness for the unrelated lookalikes. Very small, most negative, but the mean was minus 0.05. If you compare those traits for MZA twins, which again, remember they parallel them because they look alike and were separate in their rearing, 0.53. MZT twins or MZ together, 0.48. Even the fraternal twins, who don't look alike, are higher than the unrelated lookalikes. Now, this is very interesting, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a story of what happened to me and why I was able to replicate this using the 60-item NEO. I presented my data at an international conference on the unrelated lookalikes, and at the end of the session, this young investigator came up to me and he said, "You're not going to believe this, but I also studied those same unrelated lookalikes when I was in Canada, only I thought they would be very similar. And when I found that they were not, I gave up the project." So I said, "Send me your data, I'll analyze it as I've done mine, and we'll collaborate." So he sent me his 60-item NEO, and we had exactly the same pairs. He had 2 additional ones. I mean, it was a perfect constructive replication with same subjects, different examinations, different investigators. And we had very similar findings. I found, based on his data, a mean correlation of minus 0.03. When it came to self-esteem, the unrelated lookalikes, again, a correlation of minus 0.03. And you compare that to MZ male and female twins. The similarity for self-esteem is less than for personality, but nevertheless, there is a modest genetic component there, but virtually 0 for the unrelated lookalikes. So, unrelated lookalikes show little resemblance in the big 5 personality traits, as well as in self-esteem. It appears that MZ co-twins' personality similarity mostly reflects their shared genes. Reactive gene-environment correlation would seem to best explain MZ co-twins' similar treatment by others. And remember, this is what I called reactive gene-environment correlation, the idea that you react to somebody based on their behavior. Okay? So these are the same questions that I gave to the twins raised apart that I showed you much earlier in the hour. And these were also completed by the unrelated lookalikes with the question, in my mind, is physical similarity associated with social closeness? So I graphed these out, organizing the responses a bit differently, but what you can see is that for initial closeness, the highest category is not close and not familiar. And when you ask them to fill it out in the current time frame, you can see that the biggest change is from somewhat close or familiar to not close or familiar. And the same was found for the other 2 categories. With the twins raised apart, it's exactly the opposite. They get stronger over time, not weaker. And in fact, most of these unrelated lookalikes didn't even maintain a relationship with each other. So you can ask the question, if MZA twins who look alike and did not get brought up alike, if they form a close relationship, why not these unrelated lookalikes? And I think the answer comes down to the fact that the behavioral similarity is just not there. It's just not there. That's what's so important. If you look at friendships, if you look at romantic couples, they show positive assortment for both physical characteristics and behavioral ones, but the behavioral ones are of a much stronger effect. So this all makes perfect sense. And then you might ask the question, does knowledge of twinship make a difference? Well, maybe the identical and fraternal reared-apart twins form a close relation because they know they're twins. And the unrelated lookalikes, no, they're not. But I have a few examples of, and I know examples are just not proof, but nevertheless they're tantalizing, of cases where twins got together and did not know they were twins. So I studied a pair of twins who were switched at birth in Canada. Identical boys brought to a foster situation for 2 months. When the mother came back to get them, she got one of her twins and someone else's child. And the other twin went someplace else, so she thought she was raising fraternal twins. When the real twins met when they were 20, they thought, isn't it great that we look alike and we like the same things? But it didn't occur to them for a year that they were twins. But their similar interests and abilities brought them together. There have been several examples in the newspapers and other places of opposite-sex twins raised apart who meet and marry, not knowing they're twins. And the way they discover this typically is when they have children, the children may have a genetic defect, which is more likely because they carry the same recessive alleles, and they discover that they're twins. There have been examples of half-sibling reunions, co-workers who get together, don't know they're half-siblings, find out, they become close friends and find out later that they're reunited. And young British twins studied by James Shields in England, little girls adopted by different families who met at school and just enjoyed being together. They were too small to know what a twin was. And the parents tried to keep them apart, but the girls liked each other and would arrange secret meetings. So I would say that perceived physical resemblance does not sustain close social relations in the absence of perceived behavioral resemblance. That's very important. So Emma asked me to talk about the Bogota Twins project, and I'm not presenting any results here, but I'll just talk briefly about it. I think that some of you are familiar with this, but if not, I went to Bogota, Colombia last year to study a very unusual situation. Here are the twin brothers of Bogota. On your left, you see identical twins, Carlos and Wilbur. On your right, identical twins, Jorge and William. But Jorge was raised with Carlos and William was raised with Wilbur. What happened was the two twins. Yes, I wish I had a pointer. Okay, I'll just go up there. Okay, so these are identical twins, right? This is Wilbur and Carlos, and then the other two, William and Jorge. Okay, but they did not grow up together. Wilbur was raised with William, and Carlos was raised with Jorge. So what you had was basically two sets of the same unrelated pair. Okay? So what happened to cause this? Let me see what's in the next slide. I think it might help if I have this here. Okay, so what happened was, here are the original pairs, but you have to think that they're babies, okay? So Jorge and William were born in Bogota. Carlos and Wilbur were born in Santander, in a little town called La Paz. Whenever I would Google La Paz, it would come up Bolivia. But there is a La Paz in Colombia. It's so tiny, it's not on the map. So rural, it took 6 hours by car to Velez, 1 hour to La Paz in a 4-wheel drive, and 1 hour either walking or horseback to get to La Paz. I walked. I'm afraid of horses. So, the the Santander mother, she has these babies at 7 months, and Carlos is very sick. So the grandmother takes Carlos to Bogota for an operation, and he's on a big table with lots of babies. And the grandmother goes home right away. So an aunt who's living in Bogota comes every day to the hospital to see the baby, and she takes him back to Santander. But she takes back the wrong baby. And when I spoke to her, she said to me, I fixed my eyes on the baby, but I fixed my eyes on the wrong child. Which makes me think that the switch happened very early, because they probably told her this is the baby, but already it was the wrong baby, because she was seeing this baby every day of the week that she was there. So now you have these babies raised apart, and the mothers have no clue that they're not their babies. After all, each mother knew she gave birth to twins and 2 boys, right? And as the boys grow up, there's lots of jokes in the family. They say to one, how can you be part of this family? You look nothing alike. This one's handsome, you're ugly. I mean, they say all sorts of things like this, but no one really believes it. And, you know, it raises a very important question, too, of how do mothers know who their babies are? And most people say, well, of course mothers know who their babies are. But it's not so simple. Back in evolutionary history, women would give birth in small groups with friends and relatives, so whatever baby came out of you was your baby. But in hospitals that are very big, baby gets taken away to be washed, mothers rest, accidents can happen. And yet, mothers don't worry about this because it's not part of the human female psyche. It's a good example of how evolved psychological mechanisms don't catch up with modern society. There's a trend now in the United States, in the Netherlands, and some other places for women to have babies at home. But when you ask them why, they say they want an intimate experience. They don't say anything about, I worry it's not my baby. Okay. So anyway, the way this all got sorted out was that the Santander boys moved to Bogota, and they're working in another part of the city, and somebody who knew Jorge, that one, met William in a store. He was working as a butcher, and she couldn't believe that it wasn't Jorge. And she took his photograph and showed it to Jorge, who went on Facebook. And Facebook showed, Jorge says to me, I look at the picture, I see myself in clothes I don't own, in a place I've never been, and next to me is a guy who looks just like my fraternal twin. So they try to figure out what happened. They eventually did, and they all got together. So I went to Bogota to study them, and I'm now writing a book about this, which I hope will be out maybe in a year and a half. But anyway, here are the original pairs, and here is the switch, right, between 2 of them. Now, this is a beautiful design for many reasons. Nature, nurture, evolutionary hypotheses, lots of things. Because what you have 2 pairs of monozygotic twins raised apart. You have 2 sets of virtual twins, right? But the virtual twins are a subset because they think they're fraternal twins. Most virtual twins know they're virtual twins, but these guys think they're fraternal twins. Then you have one more fascinating comparison because Jorge did not grow up with Wilbur. He grew up with Wilbur's twin. So they have no genes and no environment. But I can compare them to Jorge and Carlos, who share environment, no genes. It gets very complicated, right? And then you can do it the other way with the other 2 guys. Anyway, I'm working on trying to make it simple for my book. I haven't really found a way yet. So we gave them over 10 days a very comprehensive test battery of life history, medical, hand preference, height and weight, lots of different things, and many of these will be in the book. The book will be called Accidental Brothers, Doubly Exchanged Twins, The Lives They Led and Lost. And this will be published by St. Martin's Press in New York City. My last slide, I want to close with this wonderful comment, which is in one of my other books, And I just love this. It was said by Thomas Bouchard, the director of the Minnesota study of twins raised apart. He said, twin studies refute both biological and environmental determinism. They do not negate the effect of the environment on behavior, nor do they over-glorify the role of genes. They account for the uniqueness of each of us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nancy, for the marvelous talk. And we have time for questions. Está aberto a perguntas que vocês queiram fazer para a Nancy. Você tem? Pode passar. They are shy. They have to warm up.
Somebody must have questions. Please don't be shy. Yes,
Okay.
Oh, perfect.
Nancy, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to know, there is a study about kind of part of the behavior that don't belong to the genes, or it's two questions. First, if there are genes that are not involved in, not exactly in the same twin, monozygote twin. If there are genes that are shared or genes that are not shared, first question. And second, which part of the behavior are more genetically determined or not genetically determined?
Okay. So, to answer your first question, monozygotic twins do not share all their genes in common. We say that, but it's strictly not true. There can be point mutations. There can be differences in what we call copy number variations, sequences of DNA that do not replicate exactly. In female twins, we have 2 X chromosomes, all females, and there's a shutting down of 1 X chromosome very early in life in every cell, and that can make for differences in X-linked conditions in female twins. You can have one, say, who's colorblind and one who's not. I just saw a case study. As a doctor, you'll be interested in this. I saw a case study of 2 identical twins. They each had a recessive allele for a very serious condition. The name I can't remember. So neither one should have had the condition. But in one twin, the corresponding allele mutated to the same and gave her the condition and not the sister. So identical twins are not strictly genetically the same. Even sharing the womb, the environment is different, particularly for identical twins where the splitting is late, day 8 or 9. You get what's called the fetal transfusion syndrome, where there's a literal one-way bleeding of one twin into the other that can lead to differences in size, differences in the hemoglobin level, all kinds of things. And when the fertilized egg divides somewhat late, you get differences in hand preference. You can have a right-handed twin, a left-handed twin. The hair roll at the top of the head is reversed. The dental patterns can be reversed. Many things. And what really fascinates me is just how alike identical twins still are, despite the fact that there are so many things going on to make them different. And now your second question about which behaviors show more genetic effects than others. When it comes to behaviors that show the highest genetic effect, it's probably brain waves, the EEG patterns, very much alike in identical twins raised apart and together. That drops off a bit for height and weight. Height is more strongly influenced than weight. Weight is a little more genetically influenced in males than females, maybe because females are more subjected to the pregnancies, hormones, things like that. Then the next would be probably intelligence at about 70%. Let me go back for a minute, though. The brain waves are about 95%. Height 80, weight 80, intelligence about 70%. And when I say 70, I mean a heritability, meaning that the variation in a population is 70% influenced by the genes, not the environment. In a single person, you cannot separate genes and environment. You can only do it statistically in a population. So heritability is a population concept. Then about 50% of the variation is personality. values, political attitudes, surprisingly. 30% in job satisfaction, how much do I like my job, self-esteem, things like that. Now, in our Minnesota study, I don't think there was any behavior we found that was not genetically influenced a little bit. But I saw one twin study done some years ago that looked at love styles. You know, are you somebody who falls in love fast? Or it takes you a long time to get used to the person? And they found no genetic influence there at all. I was hoping that that would be replicated because I think it's interesting and maybe that's the way it is. I don't know. But it seems to me love style should be genetic to some degree, but I don't know. That was the only one I found. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to ask a question. Now, Yarika.
Thank you, Nancy, for a wonderful talk, and I'm definitely looking forward to reading the new book. And I only have one small question about the study where you were focusing on twins who had different partners and they had children, and you were actually asking how they felt about the nephews and nieces. So have you also asked the nephews and nieces how they felt about the parent and the aunt or uncle? Because that would be...
That's a wonderful question. Did I ask the nieces and nephews how they feel about the twin parents and the twin aunt? Right, and no, I haven't. That would be the next step in that. That would be a wonderful way to do that. I can tell you that anecdotally, when I speak to people, they feel very close to the aunt and uncle if they're monozygotic twins. But I can only say that anecdotally. I would love to study that. I really would. I would love it.
That would be great. Thank you. Okay, I have one more.
Everybody has two questions, Ricardo and you. It must be something about the twins. Everybody has two questions.
So, now about the study on the unrelated lookalikes. So actually, you said that they didn't feel so close about each other socially, right? They weren't so close as the other monozygotic or dizygotic twins in your other studies. But actually, what is interesting, there are studies showing that some personality features or personality characteristics, they are perceivable from faces or from appearance. So, right now, the question is that maybe people who are similar or who look alike, they might have some similar characteristics. So actually the question would be why they are not close. And actually I think that because you have the pictures, the facial pictures or body pictures of these people, it might be actually easy to do because you can always like cut the face and let them rate it by independent raters to see if they would rate, I don't know, extraversion, openness and all these personality characteristics similarly between these two people. Because as I saw these pictures that you showed us, they look similar, but I think that I would rate them quite differently according to many social and personality characteristics.
Well, the pictures, I've looked at them quite a bit, and I think they look a lot alike, and if I met these people independently, I think I would confuse them, as you would identical twins. But when they're together, you can see subtle differences between them, obviously. Now, your point about personality being readable from certain physical features. When you have raters look at people or look at photographs, they often come up with some personality traits, but my understanding about literature is that they don't always match the person's self-report. So, I mean, that's an important point, that there's not a match there. I do think, though, it would be worth my looking at the photographs. I think that would be worth doing, but see, I really think that what drives the MZA's closeness is the perception of similarities. And the dizygotic twins just don't have it. You know, they just don't have it. I mean, you saw the reunion here. It looked wonderful, but they just don't have it. the idea that personalities is in the face, not the brain, has always troubled me. I've just not seen enough evidence to find it persuasive, I guess.
Interesting. Thanks.
Could you talk about a little bit more about the nonverbal behavior of twins?
Yeah. So we did have sort of two nonverbal components to the study. And one was actually something that came about rather by accident. On the very first day of the study of the twins raised apart, we would have the twins stand and take their picture. And we took them unposed. We didn't say, hold your hands this way or anything like this. And we began to notice that the identical twins would stand in similar ways and the fraternal twins would not. And somebody could say, well, maybe they're copying each other. But if it's copying behavior, then the fraternals should copy as well, and they don't. And that was very interesting. These data have never been summarized anywhere, and I think it's time that somebody did it, because they really are quite striking in terms of the similar body postures the identicals have and the dissimilar ones the fraternals have. Then we did have a small study published on how twins respond facially looking at films. Films start out rather neutral, and then they get progressively difficult to watch. And we found some genetic effect on some things, not on others. It was a very small study, and I'm sorry that we didn't do more of that. But I think that the nonverbal behavior would be a wonderful component to any large twin study. And I'm just sorry that we didn't do more of it with the reared apart twins, because they would not have had a chance really to copy one another since they were raised apart.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Nara. I'm Emma's student, PhD student, and I would like to know more about creativity and art. How twin studies support or did not support genetic approach, and the relation between genetic and environment in creativity, in art result, in art outputs.
Okay. So the project that you raised about creativity and art, one of my students did just such a study, just published this year. And it was using the twins raised apart. All these Minnesota twins were asked to draw a person and draw a house. And then we had these rated by people on a creativity scale. Now, the house showed no evidence of genetic effects. There was no variability across people. Everybody drew a little house with a chimney and smoke and a little path. That was it. But when it came to the person, there was a lot of variability in size and in detail. And we did find a modest genetic component to that, about 30-40% in those drawings. In the adjective checklist, there is a creative personality scale in that. And we found about the same for that as well. But I would like to see more done in the area of art and creativity. At the last International Twin Congress I went to, there was actually an identical twin there, and she and her sister are both artists, and they're doing a lot of study in art. The problem is it's not quantitative. They're doing a lot of these kind of life histories and narratives, which are fascinating, but you know, you want to get the quantitative data as well. But I think it's a field that's wide open, and anybody who wanted to do it could really make some important contributions. You know, there are some famous identical twin artists out there. Yeah.
I would also like to hear you speaking about your experience with affection and other studies. The Pennsylvania test, I think you used.
Yeah, well, I did a study on olfaction at one time where I looked at sensitivity to smell with twins raised together, and I found a modest genetic effect for that. What I find more interesting are the studies that see if people can identify relatives based on T-shirt smells. I think those are much more interesting. And I did one once although I see now the design was not right, but I think if I were to do it again, I would have a twin wear a T-shirt, both twins wear T-shirts, put out 3 T-shirts, and see if the co-twin could pick out the twin from the 3. That's what I should have done. What I did instead was have an unrelated person do it, and that was a mistake. But I recently reviewed some of the research on whether dogs can distinguish twins, and they can. They can. Yeah. Very fascinating stuff.
That makes it study with Yarka.
So I have a question, Emma. I just want to know how many twins are in the audience. Raise your hand. Just 2. See, looking at us, you couldn't tell that we were twins. We're not twins to each other, but we're twins to other people. Just to tell you, I'm a fraternal twin. I have a sister who looks very little like me and is very behaviorally different than me. And that is what really sent me in this direction. I love psychology, and when I read about twin studies as an undergraduate student, it was sheer joy, pleasure. I loved it so much, and that became my career. I knew when I was a senior in college what I was going to do the rest of my life.
Mais perguntas, pessoas? No? Well, thank you very much, Nancy. Fascinating issue, fascinating studies. E, enfim, muito obrigada, Nancy, muito obrigada a presença de todos. E iniciamos aqui uma colaboração. We are initiating a cooperation, that I hope will stay for long years.
Thank you very much.